Hello everyone, my name is Nick, and this is going to be a video review of the John Suscovich chicken tractor in correlation with the Kindle book version of that, as well as some of my modifications that I've done in comparison, as well as some extra notes. This will be our first year doing chickens. We have not done any livestock before. We have kept bees for one season. So this is going to be a very new experience for us. What we want is local small farm chicken meat, which is not available here. And we want it ethically raised, and we chose Red Rangers for their hardiness, but might go into that in a different video. We've watched John Suscovich's chicken tractor videos, specifically his start to finish for his chickens, the weeks 1 through 8, I believe. Those are very helpful, and we really appreciate John producing those. We did like his tractor design the best. There's shorter ones, smaller ones. What we really liked being able to walk into it and how secure it is as well. So I did buy the Kindle version of it, of the book on Amazon, which is currently $10 versus $14 for the paperback, is a second edition. So any of the comments I'm going to make are specifically the second edition of the Kindle ebook. Overall, my opinion is that book is worth the cost. The other thing I like about purchasing that book is that it supports John's business and supports him producing videos. However, I would give this book a 3.5 out of 5 because of some of the issues that I'm going to talk about. Today is May 2nd, 2021. We purchased these materials about a month, 1 to 2 months ago. And our cost, including getting the conduit EMT bender, was about $325. In the book, John says he can build them around $200. With the lumber shortage and high prices, that's definitely a factor for us. That cost does not include hinges, rope, or the tarp. We considered purchasing a tarp on Amazon. The size, as many people comment, is a little hard to find, but we have a boating maintenance store near us, business, and they have in our area in northern Wisconsin, people overwinter their boats with a blue plastic tarp, and that's readily available for us, and I've used it in the past to mulch ground, so we're going to attempt to use that. This is the material. It's a blue plastic, and they use it to shrink wrap around the boats, and it's very weather durable. I also want to thank Randy Kleinman for his video. He goes into detail about his opinions on the chicken tractor. He's built 2 of them, and a few of my ideas that I have here are thanks to him. The links to the book on Amazon, as well as John Suscovich's channel and Randy's channel, are in the description. If you don't really know anything about this chicken tractor, let's just go over it briefly. It has a hinged front door. It's about 5, it's a little over 5 feet to the peak. The door is about 5 feet. I'm 5'8"-ish, so that works out pretty well. Do have to crouch a little bit, but compared to having a 2-foot tall chicken tractor, this is a huge improvement. There are wheels on the back that are held on with carriage bolts, and that makes it more mobile. This rope in the front is to move it. However, it is quite heavy, so it's quite doable to pull it, but backing it up and turning around is a bit of a hassle. I built this chicken tractor in SketchUp, which is a 3D modeling software, and in doing that I realized some of the issues from the book that either I didn't understand properly or were a little confusing. But I also found that the measurements John gives you produces a bit of waste on some of the end cuts. So I actually made this a little bit wider, which eliminated some of the end cut waste from the material. So I did have to make some other measurement changes. But as you see, it worked out very well. John does mention this in the book, but I wanted to put a little more emphasis on it since he mentions it briefly. When you're working with pressure-treated wood, you need to make sure that you use the approved fasteners, otherwise they'll rust out quite quickly. So regular zinc-coated fasteners or even bright finish fasteners, you really shouldn't be using. For this specific product, the approved fasteners are stainless steel or galvanized steel, as the triple coated screws that he recommends and that we used as well technically aren't recommended, but they'll work just fine. Something he doesn't mention at all is the staples. He suggests using a pneumatic stapler, which we used a narrow crown pneumatic stapler. I did a test with T50 electrically shot, not with a manual hand stapler. But I did some tests, and the T50s, they really didn't hold very well. The narrow crown, I tried a 3/4 inch and 1 1/4 inch long. They both held great. I ended up using 1 1/4 inch because I chose to use stainless steel staples because we did have some galvanized staples available, but I figured those would work the best with how thin the coating would be on them. Those would be electro-galvanized staples and not hot dip, which is specifically what is supposed to be used, and the electro-galvanized coating is quite thin. But 1 1/4 inch staples was all I could get in our area. John does recommend and mention in the book about using exterior wood glue. I use Titebond 3, which I use for other projects, and that's very good for outdoor purposes, but make sure that you're using a waterproof exterior grade wood glue. Something I haven't seen anyone else talk about is using a end sealer, especially on the cut ends of the pressure treated wood. That's really important for stuff that's below grade, that's going to be buried. I did buy some, but I ended up not using it because our weather conditions are a little cold to be staining the wood. But that is something we might want to consider. It's also, I considered that it wouldn't have a whole lot of time to dry, and the potential for it to leach into the soil could exist. That also does exist with pressure treated wood. If you look at the safety data sheet for pressure treated wood, it's technically not recommended around livestock in case there's a potential for them to consume it. So again, that's something to consider, but many people have used pressure treated wood in this case, so it's relatively safe. I also chose to put the EMT conduit on the inside. I screwed it on the inside. This is something I really wanted to do, and I struggled with finding a good way to do it. Randy shows us as well in his first chicken tractor. He puts it on the outside, and that's kind of a pain with putting the mesh on. Randy's second chicken tractor that he made, and I've seen 1 or 2 other people do this as well, is to drill 1-inch holes into the 2x on the top, and then it just sits in there. I don't really like that idea because that increases the chance of cracking in the 2x material. So I was able to put it on the inside, but I had to do 3 separate measurement bends, partly because one of my horizontal pieces was cracked, so I had to put a supporting structure on there. Really liked Randy's idea with using the EMT pull elbows. Along with that, I used EMT straps, which I use on trellises for garden. I had some of these already. I use those straps elsewhere as well, but that just screws right onto the top of the elbow, and that I really like that rather than zip tying the ridge pole to the other pieces of conduit. Also, something that's not really mentioned in the book is what order to put the wire mesh on. What I think is the best way is to put the end walls on first and then put the roof on, and that covers, because we're not cutting the roof material unless you choose to. You don't have to, but that covers any of the raw edges. After that, I put the hardware cloth on again so it would protect some of the raw edges from the chicken wire that was cut, and less chance of the tarp ripping due to pieces of wire. I did start out by using tin snips to cut the chicken wire. In the past, I've cut hardware cloth with an angle grinder and a cutoff wheel. I did that and it worked much quicker. If you have an angle grinder, I would definitely suggest that. John mentions cutting the zip ties. We still have some finishing touches to do and some more zip ties, but I would definitely recommend using flush cutting pliers and not just diagonal wire cutters. They're a couple bucks on Amazon. I'm sure you'll find uses for other things, but if you leave a tag on these zip ties and you bump into it, you could get a pretty nasty cut. The other thing that's been talked about by a couple of YouTubers, and I also struggled quite a bit with, is the directions for the door are either not correct or they're extremely confusing in the book. One of the biggest issues I had in the book is he gives you very good instructions for all the materials and all the cuts, and once all of that is done, he kind of just gives you a diagram for putting it together and doesn't explain anything. So what I found when I built the 3D model in SketchUp is the vertical pieces for the door and the frame, one or both of the measurements seemed to be incorrect. Randy talks about this as well, that when he built his first one following the book, it only comes to the top of this 2x, and in the second edition of the book, maybe not the first, there's a half lap joint here. And in order for it to come down, you need to add 3.5 inches to that. Based on my SketchUp model and how I was understanding the diagram in the book, I believe I did things slightly differently comparing to an older video from John with his chicken tractors. This top and bottom piece is on the back side of the vertical 1x4s. In the book, I believe it's implied that it sits on top like this door, and then you need these 45-degree supports. But based on that old video, I really liked how that mated and how that ends up being a backstop for the door. Some other small things that he doesn't really provide instruction on, and it's mostly based off of the diagram, is the pieces in the corner are on the inside. Obviously they wouldn't go on the outside, but they're not sandwiched in between these, the horizontal and long piece. What I found with the diagram is that any visible joints were overlaps, and they weren't necessarily butt joints like they are on this door. So that would be the exception, where on the diagram this would be a butt joint, but everything else will either overlap or go into a half lap. Also, it's important on this piece here that the half laps face out. Otherwise, you're going to have some issues with the door, and the conduit also wouldn't come right up against the door. It's also worth noting that these long runner skids. There is a short end and there is a long end. The long end goes in the back. I ended up cutting a 45 on the bottom here in case there's some rough ground. I can pull it over and it's not going to dig in. I haven't seen anyone else do that. I did take me a while to find these gussets, and that's just because they were a little hard to find at Home Depot, but if you look online, that should be pretty easy to find. I also put eye bolts in the front here. John has you drill a hole through the front piece and just put the rope through. I'm sure that's fine. I just didn't really like leaving an open hole there and then having the rope potentially wear on that. I might actually change that because with the anchor point being so close to the front, trying to back this up or turn it means the weight of the chicken tractor wants to come into you. However, this is so short, it really wouldn't make a difference. This is a piece that there is some offcut waste. So if I make another one of these in the future, I might keep this longer and then have the rope out here and make it a lot easier to turn. Something I would really suggest for doing the half laps on these long pieces, John in the book just suggests you measure it from one side. The only issue is if there's any variation in the 2x material, the measurements could be slightly off. So what I did is I put all the 4 pieces on a table, and then I took a shorter piece and laid that across where the half laps were supposed to be. I did measure it first, but then I laid a piece across, and then I penciled on the side of the 2x. And that makes the half lap cuts very accurate. I did end up having to widen them just a little bit, but that worked out really well. Everything lined up perfectly. Because we're not using a commercially available tarp, there's no grommets in it. I could put grommets in it. I've done that in the past with some tarp repair, but usually it doesn't work very well. What I'm going to end up doing is take some scrap pallet wood, lay the tarp over, and then if the tarp were coming over here, put the pallet wood on and just put a couple screws, and the whole pressure from the pallet wood is going to keep the tarp in place. That also prevent any rubbing from any potential raw edges. I may do that as well on the bottom, and then if we need to open up the bottom of the chicken tractor, doesn't get too hot in northern Wisconsin, but we could then remove that and then just tie it up. And just show you a little close-up of the inside here. This is what I did with the conduit. I found this really helpful. We put the straps on, we clamped it down, and then put a strap on all of the conduit and a half strap for those. And what that enabled us to do is to connect the ridge pole when everything is adjustable. So if these were slightly off, or if the height was slightly off, we could adjust that so there wasn't a bunch of tension on the ridge pole. Again, probably not a big deal, but I found that really helpful. But I did end up putting 2 screws through the conduit, which John does recommend. Last thing I almost forgot about is I built this little tool or jig. This was my first time bending conduit, and I wasn't super comfortable with trying to do all the calculations. So I just bent a 45 in this piece of scrap that I had laying around. Before that, I marked every 1 inch. And what that allowed me to do, I could clamp the straight pieces of EMT connected to the pull elbow to the top, and with the EMT coming straight down, I could just line this up, and this being straight, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 being straight, I could sight down to see where I wanted to attach it, mark that line there, and then just measure 4, and then this is where I put my arrow on my bender, rather than trying to calculate everything or guesstimate. Again, I want to thank John Soskovich for his book and his YouTube videos. I hope my video helps you build his chicken tractor a little bit easier.